Greetings, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me. It's Christian of Standing Stones Healing. So honored and excited to be here with you to talk a little bit about a podcast for your Reiki business. Yes, indeed. Do you have a podcast for your Reiki business? A podcast can be an awesome thing to have for your Reiki business. You know, I am the host of my podcast, Build Your Reiki Business, and it is a great way to get the word out there, to connect with people, to allow people to get to know me and to learn about Reiki business. So it's a wonderful thing to have a podcast for your Reiki business. Some great things about it are that people get to hear your voice, and so they can hear you, they can get to know you through your voice. Maybe they can't see you, but in hearing your voice, they can get to know you in that way. The voice is very powerful. You know, I talk about content assets in terms of content creation. And video is very important in terms of content creation because people can see you, people can hear you, they can see your mannerisms, and they can get to know you in that way. Second on that list, I believe, is audio, because they can't see you with audio, but they can still hear you. They can hear your tone of voice, hear your inflection, and get to know you through your voice. And so audio is very powerful for helping people to get to know us, to maybe hopefully like us, and to even hopefully also trust us in our Reiki business. So a podcast is really great for this. Another awesome thing about a podcast is that it is the kind of content that grows over time. So, you know, when you post on Facebook, this video on Facebook, for instance, will be gone in a couple of days. No one will be seeing it. No one will even know that it existed after a couple of days. But with my podcast episodes, for instance, this week's podcast episode is about podcasts. That is only going to grow over time. More and more people will be listening to it over time. And so it will grow in that way. It is a content asset for my Reiki business. So I do highly recommend considering having a podcast for your Reiki business if you don't already. Now, if you're thinking about a podcast for your Reiki business, there are some special considerations. Number one, recording is important. You may have heard a little meow around me. That's my kitty. She wants love and attention right now. As a matter of fact, right now she is getting up at one of the plants because she knows that I'm going to come tell her no and give her attention. I know, it's a ploy. But this is a major consideration if you want to have a podcast for your Reiki business. That is cats or other noise that might be made while you are trying to record your podcast. You might also have cats. You might have children. You might have noisy neighbors. You might just have life going on around you, and trying to find a way to record in peace and quiet can be a challenge. Yes, indeed, it's the story of my life right now. To the point where I have resorted recording podcasts outside of my home so that there is some peace and quiet when I am recording, and we are recording in relative peace. So whether or not you have cats and the noise that you might have in your recording space is definitely a consideration if you are considering a podcast for your Reiki business. Another consideration that is important for you is your podcast format. So what kind of format do you want to have with your podcast? Do you want to have a solo podcast, or do you want to have guests? Now, I decided to have a solo podcast for Build Your Reiki Business because I do have guests on my Reiki Business Collective series, and because I wanted Build Your Reiki Business to be a weekly podcast, I knew it would be so much easier for me and for my schedule and for my life to have it as a solo podcast. And so that is a solo podcast, but I do have guests on Reiki Business Collective. So how you have your podcast format, solo or guests, is completely up to you and what it is you want for your podcast. What really matters with your podcast, a big consideration, is your audience. Who is your audience for your podcast? So who are you reaching with your podcast? Who are you serving with your podcast? Who is your audience? So this is a major consideration. Depending upon your audience, you may go solo or you may have guests, whatever is a better fit for your audience. So when you are considering starting a podcast, the audience is really going to be a major consideration. And that's going to help determine your format. That's also going to help determine your length. How long do you want your podcast to be? You know, we hear so often now that people's attention spans are short. No one wants to tune in and pay attention for a long time. Long form content is dead, and you need to keep your content short. But we know that people will binge Netflix episode after episode. And so if you can watch 3, 4, 5 episodes of a show, one after the other for hours, it's not about attention span. It's actually about the engagement and the interest that the audience has in the content. And so it's important to know that long form content is not dead. It's just about the engagement of that content and the interest level of the audience that dictates how long they will watch for. So that's an important consideration when you are starting your podcast for your Reiki business. How long do you want it to be? Another important consideration is the topics. So what will you have on your podcast? What will you discuss on your podcast? What are you going to talk about on your podcast? So whatever the topics are, of course, what your audience is interested in will help to guide that, as well as your own particular interests. What interests you? And it's important to find that intersection between what interests you and what interests your audience, because you want to make sure that you are creating content that interests you as well. So what interests you? And to make sure that you are creating content that also inspires and excites you as well as your audience. Some other considerations for starting a podcast are your podcast platform. So where are you going to host your podcast? Now, in deciding where to host your podcast, there are different considerations. Build Your Reiki Business is hosted on Spotify. So I do use Spotify. It is a free podcast platform. There are plenty of free and paid podcast platforms out there. I do find that Spotify for podcasters, that's what the free version is called, is pretty simple to use. It's user-friendly. I enjoy it. But of course, there are other podcast hosting platforms out there, like BuzzFeed, for instance. Some of these hosting platforms do charge a fee if you go over a set amount of time of recording or uploading for your podcast per month. So that's something important to keep in mind as you are considering where to host your podcast. One great thing about having your podcast hosted on different platforms is that they will suggest your podcast to listeners. So you might have on your podcasting platform the ability to have other podcast listeners who are not already in your audience find your podcast. And so for my podcast, Spotify will have what are called impressions, where my podcast will show up as a recommended podcast for listeners, and I can get listeners in that way. And so thank you, Spotify, for the free advertising. This is a great way to grow your audience and to get people to find you who wouldn't ordinarily find you. There's something very important, though, about podcasts that you need to know, and that's called the RSS feed link. When you have a podcast, in order for your podcast to be found on platforms other than the host where you have them, other than the platform that you have them, it's important to make sure that you are sharing your RSS feed with other podcast platforms. So I have my podcast on Spotify. I needed to share my podcast RSS feed link with Apple, for instance, so that it could show up on Apple Podcasts and people can listen to it on Apple Podcasts. Same thing with iHeartRadio and other podcast platforms. I needed to go to those platforms and share my RSS feed so that it would show up in those other platforms as something that people could listen to. So this is very important to know if you are starting a podcast for your Reiki business. Otherwise, your podcast will only be able to be found on your podcast platform, and that will severely limit your podcast reach. So that is important. Now, if you'd like to know more about podcasts for your Reiki business, do please check out this week's episode of the Build Your Reiki Business podcast at standingstoneshealing.com/podcast. If you're tuning in on YouTube, I'll drop that YouTube link directly so that you can go there and tune in to that direct podcast. So do you have a podcast for your Reiki business? Drop it for us down below. Let us know. Leave it in the comments. Leave the link to your podcast so that we can check it out as well. Sending so many blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business podcasts.